firstly, I think this is a great talk, great book, right? And we know from Tobek Sensei's works that this was how the sector grew over the last 50 or 60 odd years. And what worked, what did not work so well, right? And the focus here, is more on the real world and the policy implications for economies, whether you're developing or developed, right? So a few things that pop up in my head as I was reading the book some weeks ago is that the supply chain here is quite successful. If you define it as a cost efficiency, very very economist way of seeing things, right? And a good example, a good proxy would be comparing the cell phone. Most of us would have a cell phone, and if you compare this cell phone to what you had merely in the you know in the late 90s or early 2000s, it's more powerful than a desktop, right? In that sense, it is more efficient. Plus, It's also cheaper. So in that sense, it is very successful. But this inverted commas, success, it comes at a price because it is so lean, it is so much driven by cost efficiency concerns that it becomes vulnerable to shocks, right? And we've seen in the last 1 2 years that it is vulnerable to COVID, trade wars, and other things, right? So that is the first observation, right? And the second part is that what's the solution, right? I mean, you have a problem, you want a solution. And all of us in various capacities, we are all paid to solve a problem, right? So there have been several proposals mooted, one of which is quite an in-demand word, the French shoring, right? The French shoring is quite new, but the broad gist I can understand. I think we all know what it means. But if you really look into it, right, how do you define a friend, a rival, and what we call a frenemy, right? Friend and enemy, right? So the other thing is you can be friends on one issue, right? But at the same time, you're going to compete against that same friend in other issues, right? So how do you mix and match? And sometimes a lot of these things they overlap into each other, right? So it might not be that straightforward. And the other thing concerns cost, right? Because what if your friend was fundamentally not so competitive, right? Are you going to keep giving him or her even more money to splurge, right? Even more contracts? That's not going to end well. And I think if you read the book, right, you could see the example of Foxconn trying to build a LCD manufacturing plant in Wisconsin, right? So in the end, people just spend their time, playing video games, watch Netflix. So that is, you could tell that this is not very productive, right? So how far are we gonna go, right? And I think that was one of the concerns raised by the IMF report recently, right? And the last observation that I have is, for a very long time, right, industrial policy it was a it was not a popular word, right? It was not a popular word. Maybe not so much in Asia. Asia, I think it's not so bad, but in other parts, it was not so popular, right? It was even chided. And over the last 1 or 2 years, it's become acceptable. Everyone does it, right? But even then, there is heterogeneity, right? The strategy of one industry is going to be different from the other industry, right? The strategy for one country is going to be different from another country, right? So this was also discussed by Thorbecke Sensei in his book, right? And in his presentation just now, is that Malaysia and Thailand, you could lump them into upper middle income economies, right? Relatively modest population size, relatively high income levels. But really, can they really push policies that bigger and richer economies can and have been targeting, right? Um, I'm not too sure about that. So in that case, would it be more realistic, more pragmatic to improve the overall business environment than to go for grand plans? Grand plans are expensive, right? And very hard to do. So in that case, in industrial policy lingo, people say you would want to go for more horizontal industrial policies that is not so selective, rather than vertical ones that are more selective, right? Because it's vertical, it targets this particular industry, that few firms. Whereas horizontal, it's more broad-based, right? It might be more fruitful if you went for horizontal ones. And the other thing is, was mentioned just now, all these things, they need a bit of money, which I think, Malaysia, Thailand, we have, but probably not as much as more, more of the richer economies. We may not have that much. So a good analogy would be to look at how much Samsung spends in R&D per year compared to the budget for, say, Malaysia, right? It's, it's actually quite big. It's staggering. Huh? So that is the last observation, the last slash policy implications that I can raise. So with that, I am very thankful for your time and energy.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lim, for your very insightful comments. And yes, all of them are very important. And you raised three the issues. The first one is the cost efficiency and vulnerability. And the second one is how we can determine our friends and enemy and frenemy. And third one is how such kind of important industrial policy could be financed. Dr. THORBECKE, would you respond?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Lim. I basically agree with everything he said. So I think these are very important comments. And what you're saying about horizontal industrial policy rather than vertical ones, that seems very wise. And I understand that Malaysia, Thailand are facing very serious challenges with industrial policy, especially compared to richer countries. But also, on the other hand, the policymakers in those countries have been very, very adept and skilled. So I'm very confident that you'll be able to come up with some good strategies for your countries.
Okay. Now we will now move on to the question and answer session. If you have any questions for the speaker, please enter them via a button at the bottom of the screen. But only 5 minutes left, so if you have any, yes, yes, I have now three questions from the audiences. The first one is that Dr. THORBECKE, you are a well-known international economist and metrician, yes. But I was surprised that you also know a lot about industrial history. Yes, I think so. As for the yuan depreciation in the Chinese graph, Chinese graph, does this mean that the Chinese government has fixed the exchange rate that way? This is the first question. And the second one, Dr. THORBECKE, what advice can you give to Japanese industrial policy from your research? So what kind of lessons we can get from the research? The second one. And the third one is that today U.S. tried to decouple economy and the technology from China, especially in advanced semiconductor field. So China tried to establish the field by their own technology. Do you think whether China will succeed to acquire advanced technology without U.S. knowledge? Okay, so please answer all the questions at once.
Great. Okay, so for the first question, thank you very much for your kind words. Actually, it was Professor Yoshitomi, who was one of the directors of RIETI, the presidents, a long time ago, who actually helped me to learn about Asia. So I came here knowing very little, but I learned an awful lot working with him about how Asia developed. In terms of the yuan depreciating, so I put the graph up. What we see is that China had a fixed exchange rate against the U.S. dollar up until, I think it was July 2005. And many Asian scholars at that point were saying this really isn't good for China. And I think China accepted those arguments. So starting in 2005, China allowed its currency to appreciate. And it was actually, I think, produced a better allocation of resources in China. So at the time, China was focusing on having an undervalued exchange rate, selling products very cheaply to the West, and it wasn't really beneficial for Chinese consumers. So China has let their exchange rate appreciate. I don't think it was so much that they've fixed their exchange rate. I think they tried to move to giving their exchange rate more flexibility. So it was fixed until 2005, but after that, they've let it be more flexible. They've let it appreciate. The second question, what advice can you give Japanese industrial policy from your research? I think this is an excellent question. And I confess, I wish I was actually more knowledgeable about this. One thing that came to my head is when you look at Japan in its most successful time, they had these amazing entrepreneurs. So Matsushita-san, Morita-san, Sasaki-san, all these amazing entrepreneurs who took risks, who basically had vision. So I'm wondering if Japan could somehow give pride of place to its entrepreneurs again. It seems like entrepreneurs were really driving a lot of these changes. So there was government industrial policy, but there was also entrepreneurs who were basically in the driver's seat. And so if we can let them occupy that role again, I think that might be beneficial. So the third question says, today the U.S. is trying to decouple the economy and technology from China, especially in semiconductors. China is trying to establish it by their own technology. Do I think China will succeed? That's an excellent question. I think that the U.S. can set them back. The Chinese are awfully, awfully intelligent, awfully hardworking, and what the U.S. is doing now is giving them a very strong incentive to develop these technologies. So I think it might take them a while, but I think they might develop these more quickly than we expect. I guess we'll see, but it's been amazing how quickly China has adopted other technologies. So they have a good chance, I think, of developing semiconductor technology, although without a lot of the advanced capital goods from the West, it's going to be much harder.
Thank you very much for responding to the questions. Dr. Lim, could you give your final comments on these questions and your final comments? Sorry. So, okay, so the answers and questions, answers, and your final comment, please.
Well, I think there's a few. These are quite loaded questions. These are quite loaded questions, and I think people over time let's look at the Japanese industrial policy. I think people tend to forget that Japan, that is the mother or father of industrial policy Asia style. People tend to forget that, and people also tend to take things for granted. There are certain things that is almost impossible to replicate, right? You're talking about things like Murata, right? Mm-hmm. You can't really find a Murata around the world. And okay, you may not do the chip itself, but you're looking at if you look at very, very high tech parts and services, right? I think it's very, very difficult to find that, and you require different institutions for that, right? And I think those institutions are not that easily forged by other economies, right? And that is a niche by itself, right? So if we look at that, and there is niches of excellence, and perhaps that could be something that could be extrapolated. So that is one of my observation. And the last one about America, is reducing the possibilities of tech being transferred to the Chinese economy. I think what has happened is that the question is at what price, right? The other side might still acquire it, but at what price? At what price? And history of capitalism is full of examples like that, right? If you look at what happened in Europe, that it was also like that, right? One side tries to restrict access to the other side, So, at what price, right? And I think the other side will always create new institutions to forge this catching up. So that is my understanding.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lim. Thank you very much for your comments on Dr. Thorbecke's presentation. Actually, I am the research coordinator of the Japanese industrial policy as well. So it was very, very exciting for me, and I was really moved by mentioning that the Mr. Sasaki, he's a very influential person, and he leads the Japanese liquid panel, and his influence, he has influence on the Mr. Son Masayoshi, and even the Steve Jobs as well. Thank you very much for the understanding the Japanese industry and the history. Okay, so today's video and presentation materials will be posted on the RIETI website at a later date. Thank you very much for today's participation in our BBL webinar. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.